watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
I believe your real name is Yehuda Melach ben Moshe Eliyahu.
That's what it is.
You write very movingly, Jay, of your mother, Yedefega, born in 1898 in Czechoslovakia. She was married young. She was widowed at 24 with a son, Herschel, Harry. She only had an 8th grade education. And yet she seems to be one of those rare human beings with an enormous soul, strength of character, and a profound influence upon her children. I want you to speak first for me a little bit about your mother, Yedefega.
Well, every book, first of all, should have a hero or a heroine. My heroine is my mother. She was an extraordinary human being, and I often say that I am everything that my mother was and less, because she was so much more. I don't ever remember her being angry. This is an extraordinary memory. It was always, if she reprimanded you for some way, it was a very gentle kind of way. She would say, "Come over here, let me smack you." And when you came over, she gave you a big hug. And so, if there is any pain about the past, it is about the fact that my mother passed away at the age of 43. Without really having a life of happiness.
You write in Journey to the Golden Door of how she was remarried to a Moshe Eliyahu, who was twice her age, had 7 grown children already, and was a Hasidic Jew. And what you write is that your mother felt that your father did not know how to parent. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like to be in your father's presence and what the problems were.
To start with, I think that my father was a lost soul. And it was very common in that world where there was nothing for a Hasidic Jew to do. He couldn't have a job, to work and earn a living, so he was a hanger-on in some ways. He worked as a fisherman for a while, and then in the slaughterhouse and so on. And the reason I'm saying this, because I understand and I forgave my father for the very difficult times that we experienced in our lives. And again, it has to do with the fact that there was nothing there for a Jew to thrive on, to make a living. Anti-Semitism plus other things, and with great regret, I mentioned the fact in the book too that he didn't have time to love his children. It's tragic. I remember meeting him for the last time in my hometown, and I wrote about that in the book, that I wanted to tell him that I forgave him for the difficult times, and sort of concluded that it wasn't necessary, that he understood. And I also wanted to tell him that in my own way, I loved him, despite what the problems were.
Wonderful. You talk about your father and say 2 things that interest me specifically. One is that evidently he had a drinking problem. How did that affect you as a child?
I was a little bit ashamed of that, because there were circumstances where it was obvious that he wasn't himself, so to speak. And we underestimate children's perceptions. I was rather ashamed of the fact that my father behaved a certain way that wasn't proper.
Was he ever physically abusive to you or your mother?
Yes, he was. Unfortunately, he was. But that too I attribute to circumstances rather than dealing with a person who is fundamentally bad or evil.
You also write that, like many others, your father accepted anti-Semitism with resignation and learned to live with it. You know, Jay, there tends to be a romanticizing of Eastern European life, as if there was never a moment of pain and never a moment of ugliness. And when I read about your story, you talk about your father and the problems he had. You make reference to anti-Semitism. This is way, way before Hitler and Nazi Germany. And you even use the phrase that when you were sent away at 6 years old to a cheder, it was an inhuman practice. And it's in a chapter you call Dwarfed Childhood. So I'm asking you to speak to us for a moment about your realistic sense of what it was like to be a child in Czechoslovakia growing up at the beginning of the 20th century. What is it, and what should we know?
Well, it was difficult. It was enormously difficult because I was aware of the times. I was aware of the circumstances. So I wasn't even a full child, so to speak. At the age of 6, I already understood that there was something rotten in Denmark. For example, the fact that I was sent to a different village and to cheder and to receive charity. I was eating different days with different families. And of course, a child is shy, naturally shy. So when they would ask me whether I was hungry, I was, but I said I wasn't. And that kind of adjustment, and of course things occurred to you, maybe because of the difficult circumstances at home, I am being disowned, I'm being sent away. And I remember very distinctly that I was thinking about these things all the time. And I am amazed at the strength that I possessed as a child to overcome these difficulties.
Were you sad as a child?
Fundamentally, yes, but I attribute I was built up by nature. I think nature helped me to survive. I literally spoke to trees and spoke to flowers, and I adore animals and cats and dogs. And I think that in some way, I actually mentioned that Miriam, my cat, whom I thought that she understood Jewish, I think Miriam was my best friend. And so you found ways for survival.
You had a brother, Samuel.
Yes.
Were you close to him?
Tremendously close, because you knew that if you played with non-Jewish children, they'd basically beat up on you. And Samuel, of course, was my brother, and we played together. And we had a very special corner in our little hut where we would play soccer in this little corner. And Samuel is the other person in my life that I think about every day. He's there with me all the time, and he was barely 15 when he was killed by the Nazis. Samuel was a comfort all the time to me. He was bigger. He was a very strong boy, and I could count on Samuel to protect me from the bullies.
Even though he was your younger brother?
He was younger. He was a very strong boy, a very handsome boy. You know.
I want you to jump forward now to the time slightly before the Holocaust. It is the early 30s. Where are you? What's going on in your life? And what is your mood in general?
Well, till the age of 8, we lived in this God-forsaken village where you were conditioned. You understood that you were a Jew. They let you know very soon. In fact, when I was 5 years old, I asked my mother why I can't play with other children. And she said, well, someday you understand why. But in the meantime, I said, in the meantime, with whom shall I play? Play with Miriam, my cat. And I always say that Miriam was Jewish, you know, and that Miriam is not going to harm you. So you understood those circumstances. Well, at the age of 8, we moved to a town, to Munkac or Mukachevo, where circumstances were not much better. My mom was able to find more work, and it was very, very, very difficult. Poverty was one of the heavy loads to carry. I mean, on the eve of Pesach, we were waiting for my father to come home and bring a donation of matzahs, or he brought me a pair of shoes because I didn't have shoes, and I tried them on, and they were sort of very tight, and so I said to him, I said, Tata, the shoes are very tight. He said, you don't understand. It's not that the shoes have to fit your feet. It's your feet that have to eventually fit your shoes. And you understood that even as a child, that these are difficult times and somehow you have to live them. Find a way to survive. And one of the comforts were that, let's say at around 8 or 10 o'clock, when I covered myself with a blanket, the world was at peace, you know. I was in bed, and now no one is going to beat up on me, or there won't be any harsh, ugly words against Jews.
What about Jewish tradition in your home?
It was fantastic. It was built in you. I am amazed that despite poverty, we were rather pious in our way. And I remember that my mother listened to me when I was doing the prayers, and she said, Melechku, Yehuda Melech, I want you to pray with kavanah. And I didn't quite know what kavanah was. Well, I finally understood that everything has to be done with kavanah. The way you pray, the way you work, the way you study. And that was such a wonderful metaphor, because to this day I think I can't do things any other way but with kavanah.
For those who don't know the Hebrew word kavanah, define it for us.
Well, fervor, belief. There's a scene in Shakespeare where Claudius is about to pray for forgiveness for the killing of his brother, and somehow he's not quite honest about it, and Shakespeare says, prayer without meaning cannot to heaven go. And so I understood that prayer has to have kavanah. Kavanah is fervor and belief, and feel it, live it, actually.
And you lived your entire life with kavanah.
With kavanah.
So then what happens?
Well, at the age of 10, unfortunately, poverty dropped me out of school. We were in very bad shape physically, and my father finally left us. They divorced when I was 10 years old. And then the responsibility fell on the children to make a living. My mother was already ailing in some way. So I became a ball boy on the tennis courts. Every bad story has a silver lining. I turned out to be a pretty good tennis player because I was a ball boy. And it was very difficult because you were mistreated by people as a child.
How?
You were a bit of a slave. For example, this guy was serving, one of the players was serving, and he missed the shot. He turned around and hit a ball at me. Angry, or people they were supposed to play to pay for your ball work. There were people who just walked off and never paid you. And I once approached this gentleman, the rich man. I said to him, you know, you forgot to pay me yesterday. And he said, well, that's rude of you to even mention it. So even there, that world was a very cruel world to live in. And then I did work, for example, I distributed firewood on the street of my hometown, pulling a cart with 21 baskets of wood. And I watched other children going to school, and I wept. I pulled the cart to the side of the street, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful to be in a warm classroom with other children? But that privilege just didn't materialize for me.
You mentioned how your mother wanted you to do everything to pray with kavanah. Was there other richness of tradition? Was there Shabbat in your home? How did you celebrate holidays?
Yeah. Friday night was the most beautiful night. We lived in this little God-forsaken hut. But when my mother lit candles, it was as though the Shechina, there was such a peaceful sense. And we sang so many wonderful songs, and to this day I love to sing songs. So the Shabbat was a very, very precious day, Shabbat Eve and during the day, and we walked long distances to get to a synagogue that was in a different village, which I enjoyed Yiddishkeit enormously. I found peace in prayer, and it was one of the things that one of the comforts.
Do any of the melodies you sang as a child still ring in your head?
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you mentioned it. It's sort of very touchy. My brother Harry passed away recently, and he
That's your half-brother.
My half-brother, and he had Alzheimer's. And I visited him all the time, every week, and we sang all those songs. And the fascinating thing was that he, with the Alzheimer's, still remembered those lovely songs that we sang together.
Sing one melody for me.
Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Things like that,
Lovely,
and
lovely.
many other songs.
Lovely. Any nigunim?
Yes. I'm trying to remember, but Yiddish songs. My mom sang a song, Ich bin nur ein Proster Shuliach. It talks about the Malach HaMavet, who comes for you.
The angel of death.
The angel of death. And the angel of death says, listen, there's nothing I can do, I'm just a missionary, I'm
A messenger.
A messenger that I have. And things like that remained with me all my life. I sing these songs, quite often.
So then what happens in terms of the approaching storm?
Well, first of all, at the age of 12, I became a mechanic apprentice. And this was very unusual because the word was out that Jewish boys cannot become good mechanics, and I proved them wrong. I jokingly say that I'm still a good mechanic, and I'm still a good Jew. Life was very difficult as a mechanic. You were basically abused. For 3 years you worked for nothing, and worked long hours. And just when I finished apprenticeship, when I was able to actually help the family in some substantial way, my mom was very ill, and she passed away. And soon after, before I reached the age of 15, I was taken into a forced labor camp.
Do you remember the passing of your mother?
Yes, very, very vividly.
It must have been extraordinarily painful.
Well, the day that my mom was to die, she died in the evening, she took a walk. It was very extraordinary that people who suffered from tuberculosis had some lucid moments, and she walked with me that day. I was so amazed that she was able to get out of bed and gave me some assignments for life, so to speak. She said to me, I want you to be sure to go back to school someday, and I want you to be sure that Samuel, my brother, also goes back to school. And that was such a motivating force. I think when I arrived in America, I remembered those words resounded. They were always there. Go back to school. So that my educational legacy belongs to my mother.
You must have known then that she was going to die.
Yes. We knew because she was going into hospitals, coming out of hospitals, and nothing was done for her.
You loved her very much.
Yes, yes. I think that there is no other person in my life that was more influential in so many ways. I think she was really, in so many ways, the metaphor for my life.
Develop that one more moment. What do you mean? The metaphor.
Well, so many things that I do, the way I behave ethically or morally, I inherited from her. For example, I was in New York, and on 32nd Street there was a beggar with a hat, and I bypassed him. And suddenly I remember that my mother said, "You never bypass a beggar." So I walked back 3 blocks, you know, to put $1 in his hat. And I think that that's so extraordinary that that voice is always there to tell you that this is right and this is wrong. And incidentally, when I come to places like New Jersey where you can get very easily lost, I look up at the sky and I say, "Mom, they gave me the wrong directions." And I hear a voice that says, "Make the next right turn, you'll be there." You know, so in that respect, it's such a solid frame of reference.
You carry your mother with you all the time.
Yes, yes, literally on a daily basis. And whenever there are troubled moments, you know, and by the way, in my synagogue in New Rochelle, there is a plaque for my mother, and it may seem absurd to other people. Every time, every morning I come, I kiss that flag, and every time I leave, I kiss the flag. And I'm going back, by the way, now to Budapest. From there, I'm going to go to Mukachevo, to my mom's grave. It's terribly important for me to do that.
Where are you both geographically and in life as Hitler begins to come to power?
I was in Budapest working as a mechanic, and it was from Budapest that I was taken to forced labor camps.
And how does that happen? One night what? One afternoon what?
When one night, one day, the signs are out that all Jews of a given age, starting with the age of 10, should report. And we were talking among ourselves, our friends, saying, "Well, this is ridiculous, we don't have to do it." And someone very quickly informed us that all the information they needed, they knew where we lived, they knew how to find us, they knew how to arrest us, and so that there was no way out. There were very few Jews that did not report to forced labor camps.
What year are we talking about?
I'm talking now about 1943.
Okay. Kristallnacht has come and gone.
Yes.
When Kristallnacht occurs, does it have any impact on you?
None whatsoever.
Because?
Because we didn't know. Everything was done in such a compact, quiet way. We knew that Jews were being, for example, we had a sort of a mini pogrom in Munkacs, where Jews were beaten up on the street and so on, but that was done and forgotten. And from then on, we went on with the Jewish philosophy. It will be better someday. You know, we were hopeful about things that were rather hopeless. And the same thing happened in Budapest. You are going to go to forced labor camp, but surely everything will be okay. And then you were naive enough to be deceived. For example, when the first day in forced labor camp, the Hungarian officer gave us a patriotic speech telling us how much we are going to contribute to the war effort as hard-working Jews. And given that you didn't have any other way out, you sort of partially believed it.
Did you really have any sense, before you were taken to a labor camp, of the plight of Eastern European Jewry?
Not really.
Did the word Holocaust death camp, Auschwitz, mean anything to you?
No, no.
Nothing.
I was in forced labor camp for about 7 months and still didn't know, you know, that, less than that. Yeah, close to 7 months. And we didn't know. We knew that people were being killed. We listened to BBC and things like that. But the Jewish issue, BBC was not interested in the Jewish issue.
So one of the things that we have to understand is what people in your situation did not know. You knew very little.
Yes. There is a definite sort of Jewish fault within us that you always, I was already used to the idea of discrimination as a child. And so I said to myself, well, that passed, and this is going to pass as well. So you were self-deceptive, basically.
Do you think your community should have been warned?
Yes, it should have been warned, but I think that even people who were the leaders of the Jewish community couldn't believe the things that were going to happen. And it's perfectly, it's almost normal because things have happened before and we emerged out of them. And so you were thinking, well, this too shall pass.
You've described difficulties in your life from the time you were a child. How much worse is the labor camp compared with the life you'd had earlier?
It's interesting. I was so well conditioned to difficult times. For me, hardships were a modus vivendi. That's how I lived. And I watched some other of my fellow inmates in forced labor camp. They were suffering so much, and I was such an optimist. You know, I said, "Oh, things will be okay," and somehow I actually believed it.
What did you literally do in the camp?
Well, we were building airfields, landing fields for the airplanes, and one of the things that the consequences of that was that we were bombed on a daily basis. I worked in a huge factory outside of Budapest, and I worked in a furnace where they were smelting in a smelter, and we transported all kinds of old metals to be melted down and then to make bombs out of them. It was hard work, but in my case, speaking for myself, I already knew what hard work was, so it didn't matter. And I also knew that I had to mend my own trousers and wash my own clothing, and I did much better than many other kids that came from privileged families.
Where was your brother Samuel?
My brother Samuel was still home because they were taken in '44. And I'm talking now about '43. I'm in forced labor camps.
Why wasn't he taken with you?
I was taken from Budapest.
I
and
see.
he remained in Munkacs. He was first taken to a ghetto in Munkacs, and from a ghetto a transport straight to Auschwitz.
In 45.
In '45.
So what happens to you next?
Well, in the forced labor camps, when we heard that people were being killed and so on, a dear friend of mine by the name of Imre, who was a university student, said, "Come on, Yehuda Melech, we are not going to allow ourselves to be, lambs to the slaughter." He said, "I think we should get out of here." And this was outside of Budapest and this huge factory. And I said, "I have no place to go." He got in touch with his mother, and she was in a ghetto, but they had a connection with a blind professor from a university that was supposedly going to hide the whole family as well as myself. And so we engineered an escape. It was not a question of bravery, by the way. It was a question of wanting to live somehow. And despite the fact that the day before we escaped, and they executed a dear friend of ours, who was in camp, right in front of the entire camp. They showed us what happens to people that escape. But
what did they show you?
Oh, execution. He was killed. He was shot right in camp. And I mean, every time I think about these things, those are the things I cannot forget. That kind of thing. It sits. That's what sits with a Holocaust survivor, by the way. I mean, you have a label, but going with that are so many other things. And anyhow, we escaped.
What do you mean? Stay with that for a moment.
I think that it is very difficult for people who didn't have a given experience what that experience is like. There is a great deal of empathy, there's a great deal of sympathy. For example, if it weren't for the American Jews and the Canadian Jews, I think some of us would still be rotting in some refugee camp. So the empathy and the sympathy and the goodwill was there. But to understand actually what happens to a human being under those circumstances is very difficult. It's almost an unfair request. When people say, I know how you feel, they really mean that I approximate, perhaps, how you feel. And so this is the kind of thing that is your intimacy. You live with that life, with your past.
But that's why you're speaking now. You're helping us understand on a dimension that many of us could never understand without you. What is it that we don't know, that we can't understand unless we hear it from the survivor himself? What is it that you saw and experienced that makes you still tremble inside?
Well, the inhumanity is glaring. I mean, I wouldn't hit a dog when I was a child. Animals were precious to me, and then when I became aware of what was happening, it's really beyond comprehension what the Nazis were able to carry out. The only thing is that when we think that we live in a civilized world, we are mistaken. There are civilized people in the world, but we don't live in a civilized world necessarily. And then when I say things are beyond comprehension, I'm a bit hesitant because in some ways we must find a way to understand what happened, whether we like it or not. But I'm still baffled. I'm still baffled by other human behavior that is not as terrible as what happened, by the way, in the Nazi world.
What are examples? Give me 2 examples of what you saw, which at one point would have been incomprehensible to you in terms of human behavior.
What, for example, the execution of this poor boy in forced labor camp. We were supposed to contribute to the war effort, and instead, that was my first horrendous experience, and seeing death before my eyes.
How did it make you feel?
Oh, that I was the next victim, and it almost felt that, well, if this is the way the world is, that life isn't really worthwhile. I had many thoughts of that kind where I said, if this is the way the world is, then living is not really a great contribution.
Jay, were you ever terrified?
Yes, but I think something in my nature is that I recover from terror. I find ways. Yes, I was.
I would imagine that one would be frightened all the time.
I wonder why that did not happen to me. But I must tell you that there are moments of anxiety. There are dreams when I am running from the Nazis. What is so extraordinary is that when you get up in the morning, I'm in America. That I always look at that and say how it was a terrible nightmare, but I woke up and I am in a safe place. So that you are sort of vigilant, you are aware of potential danger. That came from my experience. I'm aware of that. And although I am an optimist, still an optimist, I'm an optimist with a healthy tinge of fear. It's always there. For example, some of the things that are happening now in Israel bother me so much because I connect the Holocaust to the present day. September 11, I was crying beyond control. It happened, I was at the university at the time, because I somehow felt, here it goes. So that actually I'm answering your question in a way that there is a remnant, a permanent damage in some way that is always there.
So you and your friend decide you're going to escape from this labor camp. What happens?
We get into Budapest. As we were planning the escape, we were in the factory, and suddenly we realized that we need some way to get out of here. So we got hold of an identification badge that the workers came in with. I think it was the good Lord that I walked into the workers' room, and on the wall hung a jacket with an identification badge, and I borrowed it. And so with that identification badge, we were able to get on the trucks or on the buses that the workers were taken out of the factory. And that part of my book, whenever I think of that part, it terrifies me, because that was the moment when I figured that I was going to meet the same fate as my dear friend met, that if you were discovered that you are escaping, you would have been shot. Well, we succeeded to get on the truck, and incidentally had to jump off while the truck was still moving to get into a station. We got into Budapest, and I discovered that there's no room for me.
Why didn't the people on the truck, who knew you didn't belong with them, turn you over?
I don't think that many knew, because maybe I was just lucky that they weren't the people with whom I worked. I worked with Hungarian workers, but no one recognized us. And we also made sure to say, lay low, not to be to be aware of.
Did you look Jewish?
Yeah and no. That was one of the great fortunes, I think, in some ways. Most people took me for being Italian or something. I didn't look Jewish.
So you leap from the moving truck.
Yes.
Where?
To a station, to a trolley station, from where we took the trolley and we got into Budapest. And when we got into Budapest, I discovered that unfortunately this professor already had 24 Jews, and he couldn't accommodate one more. And this, my darling friend Imre, was so sweet. He was crying. He said, there is nothing I can do. And indeed we were hiding under a staircase, and then I remained myself there. And I said, I have to get out of here. And miraculously, I concocted a story that I was a farm boy and that I wasn't Jewish. And I knew a printing shop in Budapest where one of the workers used to have lunch with me. And I figured, I'll give myself a Hungarian name. And I went to this man and said to him, I need some false papers. And he said, oh, no problem, come back tomorrow morning and I have papers for you. I came back on the following morning, and 2 SS guards were waiting for me. He betrayed me. And I still remember the shots. I started running, and I still remember the shots ringing in my direction. And I often, in jest, say that I didn't have heavy boots, so I ran faster than the Nazis. And managed to run for some 2 hours, rather hungry. And I found myself in front of an agricultural farm where my story worked, that I'm a farm boy and I know how to take care of animals. And in front of the farm, it was a farming school and a farm. I saw a man whom I describe as looking like Christ. He was such a kind-hearted human being. He must have realized that I hadn't eaten for a long time, and he immediately handed over his lunch to me, and he found a job for me on the farm. One of my jobs was to take care of 18 Clydesdale horses, and perhaps amusing, perhaps not, I became very friendly with one of the horses because I was so lonely, so afraid. Every moment in hiding, particularly if you hide yourself, if you are not hiding with other people, you are more alone. And so I was speaking to the horse, and I always, it was true, I spoke to the horse in Yiddish because I so much wanted to hear myself using my mother, Mamelution. And of course the funny part of it is that I spoke to the horse Yiddish, and people ask me why. It's because I wanted to be sure that whatever I tell him in Yiddish, he won't be able to tell anybody. And so I survived in hiding on this particular farm 4 months. And
Did you name the horse?
yes, it was Taltos. The name was Taltos, and Taltos, it was a famous Hungarian fairy tale, and Taltos was a very noble horse, and this horse behaved as though he were Taltos.
You describe how you were betrayed. 2 SS men are waiting for you when you think you're coming to get papers.
Yes.
Even as you told me the story, I was wondering to myself, was there naivete on your part? Why would you trust anyone to get you false papers?
You had no alternative, so to speak. If something came along, it was like a drowning person, you throw him a rope. And I felt that way. I felt that everything that happened was a last resort. This is a last resort. If this doesn't work, I don't think I'll survive. So you took chances based on that kind of thinking.
Also, you basically escaped from 2 SS men. It's like a movie. How do you literally escape? It seems to me that 2 adults, if they wanted to catch you, could have done so.
They could have caught me. They could have caught me. And that's very interesting what you mentioned, because I thought about that many times. They had their guns, and they could have caught me and could have shot me. And apparently, I think my mom was praying for me, praying on my behalf for survival.
So what happens after the farm?
After the farm, I'm liberated, so to speak, by the Russian army. And it was quite a horrendous experience.
Why?
2 Uzbeks come at me with rifles and with a bayonet, and comes on the day of liberation. And I keep saying, Yevrei, Yevrei, that the Russian word for a Jew. And of course, they don't understand. Somewhere on the side there is Captain Weinstein, who hears me, pleading for life. And he says, Yevrei, Yevrei, and he emerges and he says to the people, what are you, idiots? Don't you know what a Jew is? And he walked over to me and he said to me in Yiddish, "De bistaka Yid, are you really Jewish?" And yeah, and it was to Captain Weinstein that I, unloaded my soul. And
What does that mean?
Well, it was such an emotional feeling to meet a Russian Jew, a captain, and in a Russian uniform, who knew Yiddish. I mean, this was my first contact with Yiddish, with a person who understood my Mamelution, and who literally saved my life at that moment.
What did you say to him? What did you express to him?
Well, he wanted to know a bit about my experience, and he said to me in Yiddish, "Don't tell me any more of these stories. I'm very familiar with them." He told me, he exposed me to the notion that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Russian army as well. And by the way, I became, so to speak, a volunteer in the Russian army.
What does that mean?
It means that I was walking on the streets of Budapest, minding my own business, and a Russian officer with his other adjutant come over to me with a piece of paper, and they say, "We are looking for this address." And because I come from the Carpathians, and I knew some Ukrainian and some Russian, I looked at the paper, and I told them which way to go. They were looking for a Hungarian shoemaker who came from Russia originally, an immigrant came to Russia. Apparently they had reasons for interrogate him. And they said to me, "Well, why don't you take us to this address?" We took him to the address, and I wasn't privy to what they were talking about with the shoemaker, but at any rate, at the end of, they emerged and said, "Why don't you come to the officers, the Russian Officers Club for dinner?" So I came for dinner, and I could use dinner, by the way. And after dinner, I met Dinsky. Dinsky was a Jew from Odessa, a huge man. Every time I think of Dinsky, it's such a great feeling. Everyone was afraid of Dinsky. You know, this was the first time that I met a Jew that was afraid, that someone was afraid of, you know. And Dinsky turned out to be like a father to me. And after the dinner, I am walking, Dinsky walks me home, and he said to me, "You know that you are already sort of in the Russian army." I said, "I didn't say anything, I didn't know anything." He said, "Listen, they already know where you live, who you are, etc., etc." So I said to him, "Is there a way out?" He said, "No." So this is how I was made a volunteer in the Russian army.
And did you actually serve in the Russian army?
I served in the Russian army close to 8 months as an interpreter. At first, they threw me right out on the front line without any preparation whatsoever. And you can imagine it was, going from one hell to another. It was amazing what my impression was of a battlefield. I watched cowboy films as a child. Well, this was no cowboy film, And my heart went out really so much because I saw a lot of death of people right there and then, being shot. Anyhow, they took me off the front line because they discovered that I knew some Hungarian and some German, and then I was able to be helpful to them in some minor way as an interpreter. And that, in a sense, saved my life.
What about the fate of your brother?
Samuel was on the way to Auschwitz in a transport, and he was a very, very brave boy. He attempted an escape. He jumped into a river in Slovakia on the way to Auschwitz, and the Nazis pulled back the train for a couple of miles and shot him. The postscriptum to the story is that my son and I went back to Slovakia to at least find the place where he was shot. That was the first shock that I experienced in terms of immediate family when I found out about my brother's death.
And how did you find out?
The war was over, and I begged the Russians to let me go, and finally they did with great difficulty. I was given furlough time. In other words, I promised that I'll meet them again, the Russians, that they let me go for a couple of weeks. I went to Budapest, and in Budapest there was a large place run by a Jewish organization where Holocaust survivors that were returning from Auschwitz and other places were looking for survivors. And I went to such a place, and for 4 days couldn't find anybody. On the 5th day, someone said to me, "Where have you been? Your brother Harry is looking for you." And we reunited with Harry, and I talk about that often. We embraced, and for a few minutes we couldn't talk to each other, we just moaned. And it was from my brother Harry, incidentally, that I found out the fate of my brother and the fate of the rest of the family, because he was liberated on the Russian front earlier, my brother Harry was. And so he already went back to Munkac, and he already knew the total tragedy. And I was just to find out. But what was incredible was that I came to my brother's wedding as well. 2 days after my arrival, there was a wedding, and I always say we danced so hard that the floor was moving up and down, because we didn't want to remember the Nazis on a wedding day.
You say that when you found your brother, you simply moaned
Yes.
together.
Like a wounded animal.
In each other's arms?
Yes.
I want to see it. Show it to me.
Yes, well, indeed, in each other's arm, and it's a kind of almost indescribable. The feeling is that you regained a piece of life that you never thought you would regain, because I didn't imagine that he was alive. So I'm now holding in my arms, literally, a piece of the past that survived.
And all you could do is moan together.
Moan. Took a while for us, and of course, finally, after the wedding, because that was very interesting, my brother, who was more and better informed than I, said, "We are not going back to Czechoslovakia." He said he heard that in America the streets were paved with gold, so why don't we go to America? And I thought, that's a wonderful idea. I mean, go to America, do some mining on the streets of Brooklyn, and start life again. And it wasn't so easy. As you know, I spent 2.5 years in Italy in a refugee camp.
I want to say this carefully. Human suffering is human suffering. It is almost a sacrilege to try to compare one human suffering to another. You've described your story. You were in a labor camp, a forced labor camp. You were fortunate to survive. You escaped. You escaped again from the SS, and you managed to live in hiding for a period of time until you were liberated. Your life didn't get easy right away. The next thing you know, you're in the Russian army. And you were not in Auschwitz. You were not in Dachau. You were not in a death camp. And you are one of the community of survivors who now tells your story to us who barely can understand it. I want to know how you experience your communal relationship to others who have survived and who were, in fact, in death camps, who may even have escaped gas chambers. And what is that chevra? What is that community? What is the connection? And what is it that the survivor is trying so desperately to make sure the world always understands?
As far as this community of survivors, I think it's a very comforting force, because I mentioned that it's very difficult for people who did not have an experience or similar experiences to understand. Well, when I meet a Holocaust survivor, we understand each other so well. We don't need any pictures. It's in Yiddish. There's a wonderful expression, "Frag nicht," don't ask. And when I get together with these people, we don't have to ask questions. Things are rather well explained. I made reference before to the fact that I know that I am privileged or doomed, either way, to live with my memories, with my past. And the trick was, and I think that I fairly well succeeded, is to rise out of the ashes to such a degree that life is fairly normal for me, fairly normal, I emphasize, because it will never, what I lost will never be regained. But I pride myself with being a fairly good father and a fairly good husband, and a fairly normal person with a sense of humor that I inherited from my mom, definitely. So that it's really, you mentioned it, it's very difficult to compare tragedy to tragedy. But I think that we should be very indulgent and say that every tragedy is a tragedy. And the trick, again, is to find a way to emerge out of it or to live with it. I think that I walk hand in hand with my tragedy and hand in hand with my maker. He is always there, you know. And I remember making a presentation to a Jewish audience, and one of the ladies said to me, well, you are such an optimist. Where do you think God was when the Holocaust was taking place? And I inadvertently said, I think God must have been crying to see what was happening. And to conclude, I said, God doesn't make Holocaust. God heals people who survived the Holocaust. I was healed by the notion that I returned to my roots as a Jew. I think it's a big mistake for people to think that they can alter their past totally and say, I want to become something else. Well, I don't want to become anything else. I'm a Jew. I go to the synagogue. I pray. I believe in God. And at the end of Nila, when they say, Adonai hu ha-Elohim 7 times, my tears roll down the face because I belong to that prayer.
Adonai is God.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
That's wonderful, Jay. Jay, you feel that much of your work is to teach and represent life after the Holocaust. And there has been so much life to you since your liberation. And, you know, you've given us the book. You were the 1981-82 National Teacher of the Year in the United States of America, meeting the president in the Rose Garden of the White House. What a journey you have taken in life after liberation. And so I ask you to reflect for a moment on the exquisite beauty of your life that you have been able to craft after the Holocaust. And I have to ask you what it was like to be on the lawn of the White House being honored as one of the great teachers, and what greater role is there from the Jewish tradition than to be a teacher. You were honored in the United States of America as one of our greatest teachers. Talk to me about life and you and the White House.
Well, there is always, life is about retrospect, you know, you always look back. And I look back, and so often I am amazed not by my ability, amazed by what life could be like. You can wind up in Auschwitz, and you can wind up in the White House. And the irony is so incredible. As far as my educational contribution, I hope, I hope I paid back America for what it has done for me. I don't think there is any other place in the world that would take an immigrant at the age of 21 with a 4th grade education and eventually send him to the White House. To be in the White House, I was sort of pinching myself, and I said, I wonder, is this really so? Am I here? And so it's incredible what life can be like, and it comes from the fact that instilled in me was this optimism from my mom. And as I said, I'm everything my mother was and less. And I am forever so grateful that she gave me this strength. I often say to myself, as I mentioned before, I mean, there are people who have suffered considerably less, and they are somewhere in difficult places. So I consider myself very, very lucky that I was able to do, and I continue teaching. I want to teach till they are coming, with this hearse to pick me up, because it's a wonderful teaching. Is giving me such an incredible legacy. Children gave me back my childhood, in a sense, that was so cruelly taken from me.
So you have to speak for one last moment now about your wife and your own child.
Well, I have a son who is, first I should of course say that I married an English teacher, and that was very practical, because someone who didn't know how to speak English, that was very smart of me, to marry somebody who, from whom I could learn immediately a lot of English.
And as we sit together now, how long have you been married?
Oh, I've been married for 50 plus
Marvelous.
years. Yes.
And your wife's name?
Shirley Cup was the name, and of course now Shirley Sommer. My son is a poet, and he teaches at a small university in St. Louis, and he does lecture on Irish and English poetry. I am enormously proud of him. He's an incredible gift to the family.
Does he have the burden of being a child of the survivor of the next generation?
I wanted to be sure that it's not a burden, and there was a very, I don't know how I did it, but there was a gentle approach to inform him about my past. And there are several poems that he wrote about my experiences that tells me that, the poems tell me that he looks at it the same way as I do, a survivor who succeeded and who didn't allow the Nazis to win twice.
There are some survivors who have a very difficult time talking. You don't. Why do they, and why are you able to talk?
First of all, I think that speech is such a tremendous gift given to us by God, and it's by way of talking that we are able to crystallize this very, very difficult thing called life. If you don't crystallize it, even for ourselves, we are able to identify things by way of speaking to our own selves. And so it is to crystallize for yourself. To speak is to crystallize for yourself and for other people in some measure what was it like. And hopefully, as I speak to children, I'm invited to schools all the time, to make sure that they will be our guardians. Not only the memory, but they will produce activities that are counter hate. We ought to learn how to love each other, Jew or Gentile.
Jay, are you ever bitter?
I don't know how to do that. And I almost consider that to be a weakness. Because sometimes I'm too indulgent. And sometimes I feel, I wish I were a bit, more standing up for myself. But maybe that is a double-edged thing. On the one hand, I might be a bit afraid to do that. On the other hand, my mom instilled enough kindness in me not to do it.
I'm very glad you're not bitter. All the gifts you bring, the heart and the soul, the sweetness, the understanding, the patience, the compassion, and this extraordinary gift of ability to teach, I believe it's because you're not bitter. And for all those who've ever been a student of yours, Jay Sommer, you're a real gift to us. And I thank you for who you are.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing some of your story with us and for being part of Shalom TV.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.